My name is Larry Temple. I have the honor of serving as chairman of the LBJ Foundation, and I want to welcome all of you to the Tom Johnson Lecture. Those of you that may have been here at the Tom Johnson Lecture earlier with Bill Moyers, or Ted Turner, or Hank Aaron, may have heard about Tom before, but if you have, you'll have to hear it again. Those that weren't here, I want to tell you about Tom Johnson. This lecture series was created by the LBJ Foundation to honor Tom when he stepped down after 30 very successful years as chairman of the foundation. He still serves as chairman emeritus and helps us immeasurably. Tom's career shows the potential and the promise of this country. Tom graduated with a journalism degree from the University of Georgia and an MBA from Harvard. He was picked in the very first class in 1965, 50 years ago, the first class of White House fellows. He so impressed the people that he worked with that when his tenure as a White House fellow ended, he was asked to stay on in the White House. He had three pretty good mentors, one named LBJ, one named Bill Moyers, and one named George Christian. He stayed to the point that he eventually became Deputy Press Secretary and Special Assistant to the President. And then when the President left office, he came to Austin with the President to be Executive Assistant to LBJ in his post-presidency. And Tom also got involved in the family business, including radio and television. After President Johnson's death, he started his career again in journalism. Tom became the publisher and CEO of the Dallas Times-Herald. Now, the Dallas Times-Herald ultimately went out of business, but it wasn't on his watch. It was at a later time. Then the people at the Los Angeles Times that had an association with the Dallas Times-Herald saw talent when they knew it, and brought him out to the Los Angeles Times, and Tom became the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Times, and after 3 short years became the publisher of the Los Angeles Times. It didn't do much under his leadership. It reached an all-time high in circulation, an all-time high in profitability, won 6 Pulitzer Prizes, and he was picked as editor of the year. Journalist of the Year. After being there for quite a few years, Ted Turner looked out and saw him and recruited him to come be the president and CEO of CNN. Tom arrived at CNN the day before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So those of you that saw the initial part of that war, including a lot of people in the president's administration, saw that war exclusively through CNN. And Tom took CNN to all-time new heights. And not surprisingly, he was picked to be Broadcaster of the Year, very successfully. But the thing that I want to tell you that impresses me most, and it's always impressed me most, about Tom is after he left CNN, he openly and courageously announced to the world that he had been battling depression for 30 years. And he continues to say to the world, there's no reason to be ashamed, there's no reason to be embarrassed if you've got depression. Something can be done about depression. Modern medicine can contain it and maybe one day cure it. But he has saved more lives than anybody here in this room can ever imagine by telling them you can do something about depression. Take care of yourself. Lyndon Johnson used to say if he had his highest accolade that somebody was a can-do man or a can-do woman. Tom Johnson has been and is not only a can-do man, but a has-done-it man. So that's why we honor Tom, and that's why he represents the best this country has. So before we start the program, Tom's here tonight. Tom, please stand and let's recognize you. Now it's my distinct privilege to present, although he doesn't need any presentation, the Director of the LBJ Presidential Library, Mark Updegrove, who will introduce the program. Mark?
Thank you, Larry. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's honored guest. Robert M. Gates spent half a century of his life devoted to public service. He started his career in the Air Force before being recruited to the CIA, where he climbed the ranks to become the agency's director under President George H.W. Bush. One of 8 U.S. presidents, Secretary Gates has served throughout his illustrious and fruitful career. In 2006, Secretary Gates became Secretary of Defense for George W. Bush, a job he continued for Barack Obama until 2011. He is the first person to hold that post for both Republican and Democratic administrations. Secretary Gates is no stranger to the Lone Star State. He was president of Texas A&M from 2002 to 2006. Howdy. He is currently chancellor of the College of William and Mary and the president of the Boy Scouts of America. Additionally, he is the author of Duty and his latest book, A Passion for Leadership, which will be sold outside of the auditorium after this program. President George W. Bush captured Secretary Gates' reputation for leadership when he said, "Bob is a man of vision, integrity, and extensive experience." Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to this stage Secretary Robert M. Gates.
You know you're in trouble when you get that ovation to begin with, because it can only go downhill from there.
Well, I'll assist in your descent. Mr. Secretary, I mentioned, I talked about George W. Bush's praise for you, but there seems to be praise for you on both sides of the aisle for your leadership, your vision, your integrity. And leadership is at the heart of your book. So let's start there. What, in your view, makes a good leader?
Well, I write in the book that I think there is a real difference between being a leader and being a manager. And management can be taught, and it's important. Finance, logistics, personnel, all of those skills are really important. Every organization has to have them. But I write in the book that leadership is more about the heart than the head. Dwight Eisenhower wrote his son in 1943 that what was important in leadership was devotion to duty, sincerity, fairness, and good cheer. Those are not subjects that can be taught. Those are innate inside somebody. And I like to say, just because you're high on the organizational ladder and can tell people what to do doesn't make you a leader. That just makes you a boss. A leader is someone, well, a leader is defined as someone who shows the way, who is a guide. So it's somebody who's looking to the future, and it's somebody who is saying, how can we do whatever we do better and serve the people we are supposed to serve better? And so I think and the other aspect of leadership, in my view, that makes it more about heart than head, is that if you don't like other people, if you don't respect people, if you don't enjoy people, if you think you're better than other people, I don't think that you can be a successful leader in this country. And so it really is more of an emotional thing, and the ability to inspire and to motivate than it is a technical skill. And the truth is, I mean, we always need good managers, but the truth is, we're desperate for leaders.
You quote in the book Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said of Franklin Roosevelt, he had a second-class mind and a first-class temperament. Talk a little bit about temperament in terms of leadership.
Well, I think if you look at the greatest presidents in American history, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Reagan, what Holmes said about FDR holds true for all of them. They all recognized that they weren't the smartest man in the room. And even Washington would write very explicitly about how much better educated the people he had around him were. But what characterized them all was the willingness to have people around them who were smarter than they were, listen to them, integrate their views into their own instincts and experience, and then make a decision. I've left out Theodore Roosevelt because he actually was a first-rate intellect and a first-rate temperament. But for the rest, and you know, I mean, I'm paraphrasing from the book, but God help us from the smartest men in the room, because they don't feel they need any help. They don't, you know, they know better than anybody around them what to do, and they don't need any advice. They don't need any help. They also tend not to have a very good sense of humor. I like to write, of the presidents I worked for, of the 8 presidents, 2 had no discernible sense of humor. Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter. And you can draw your own lessons from that.
There was a Wall Street Journal review of your book, and the headline of which read, Advice from the Anti-Steve Jobs. And there are those who look at Steve Jobs' leadership as being archetypical. He built one of the world's largest companies, continues to be a seminal influence in the world. But he was temperamental, he was secretive, he was bullying, he was everything you suggest great leaders are not. And I understand that there are anomalies in leadership. But why would you coach somebody not to be a Steve Jobs?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question, and the truth is, there are obviously, as in the case of Apple, instances where a very disruptive leader and one who does not have the characteristics that I write about is enormously successful. But I would say that is an anomaly. And you have to make allowance for those exceptions. But as a rule, I think that people who want to lead reform and change in organizations need to be inclusive and transparent. They need to treat, I say in the book, you can be the most demanding boss on the planet and still treat people with respect and dignity. Because at the end of the day, in most organizations, both public and private, it's the career professionals who are going to deliver the mission of the organization. And if you want to reform, if you want to change things, you need to get them on side. You need to treat them with respect and dignity. You need to acknowledge their importance. You need to draw on their talent. You need to figure out ways to elicit their ideas and their recommendations and their suggestions, because often those on the front lines, and I don't care whether you're in a retail business or in the military, those in the front lines have the best view of what's not working. And so listening to them and learning from them can help you devise strategies for making improvements, making changes that will make the organization far better and far more responsive to whether to citizens or to customers.
You write in the book of companies that are revolutionary and then accept their own status quo, and that a leader should never have a finished agenda. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, when I became director of CIA, it was 6 weeks before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I had a short-term agenda and a long-term agenda. The short-term agenda was to advise President Bush and his senior associates what we thought would happen. Would there be famine when the Soviet Union collapsed? What would happen to 40,000 nuclear weapons? Would there be civil war, and so on and so forth? But the long-term challenge was, how do we redirect this gigantic apparatus called the American intelligence community away from a singular focus on the Soviet Union, which it had had for 45 years, and to a very different world that we were going to face. And so I had 24 task forces. The longest, and they reached into every part of the intelligence business. The longest deadline of any of them was 3 months. And so we got all that done by the summer of 1992. But I went on summer vacation, and I came back with a yellow tablet full of new ideas of things we still needed to do. And what I write in the book is, any leader whose yellow tablet is empty needs to go home. Because organizations, there are always new challenges, new problems, continuing ways to improve an organization, to make it better, make it more responsive. And when the new leader, as I put it in the book, when the leader runs out of gas, he or she needs to get off the road. And so I didn't want to, in the original draft of the book, the title of the chapter where I deal with this subject was Permanent Revolution. But I figured most people wouldn't get the fact that that's actually a phrase used by Trotsky. And maybe that was a little sublime. And maybe Trotsky wasn't a great example, but he coined the phrase permanent revolution. And my view is, when you're dealing with organizations, that's what you need, permanent revolution. And if you look at companies, and I cite these companies in the book, whether it's GE or Apple or Amazon or a bunch of others. I'm on the board of Starbucks. Starbucks is in the same category, I think. They're always changing. They're always innovating. They will look different next year than they looked this year. They're never happy. And the CEO can come off the best year the company ever had in history. The stock price is at an all-time high, and the CEO sits down with everybody, and he's unhappy. And he's grumpy, and he's saying, okay, how do we keep this up? How do we keep changing? How do we keep innovating? How do we keep ahead? That's true of every organization, and it ought to be as true in public organizations as it is in private organizations.
I mentioned in the introduction you've served 8 presidents, starting with Lyndon Johnson, apropos to this institution. Who comes to mind when you think of the best leaders? Who's at the top of that list?
Well, I would say that the two that I felt fit the bill best were probably Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. people forget, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so disappointed in a lot of the Republican candidates right now, because if you listen to them, as far as they're concerned, the country's going down the drain. And the one thing that Ronald Reagan, I mean, people forget how bad the late 70s were. Interest rates at 17 or 18%, inflation at 20%, Soviets had just invaded Afghanistan, there were 40,000 Cubans in Ethiopia, 30,000 Cubans in Angola, we'd just lost the war in Vietnam, the economy was in the tank, we'd been through 2 oil embargoes, and Ronald Reagan ran for president as an optimist, basically saying, this is all transitory, we can fix all this. And he had a vision of America in terms of rebuilding the economy and strengthening the military and so on, and a belief that the Soviet Union could be brought down on his watch. So there was vision and optimism. As a day-to-day manager, that was not Ronald Reagan. He had an amazing sense of humor. And I put a big emphasis in the book on a sense of humor, so I'll just tell you one little anecdote. So I'm briefing him before his first meeting with Gorbachev. And he's sitting in a wingback chair, and I'm sitting at the end of a couch right there. And I start my briefing in the Oval Office, and a couple of minutes into the briefing, one of his hearing aid in his left ear began to whistle. And it was really loud, so I figured if I could hear it, it must be painful. And he kind of winced, and he reached up and sort of adjusted it. And then I went on with my briefing, and a couple of minutes later, it was even louder that it was screeching. And he kind of got this disgusted look on his face. He pulls the hearing aid out of his ear, pounds it in his palm, puts it back in his ear, and as he's putting it back in his ear, he leans over and whispers to me, "It's my KGB handler trying to reach me." George H.W. Bush, there is no precedent in history for the collapse of a major empire without a major war until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the way Bush managed that, as I put it in my first book, the way he greased the skids on which the communists were slid from power, I think will someday get the recognition that it deserves. And it was kind of a day-to-day thing. And the interesting thing is, if you were to reverse Reagan and Bush, it would be a disaster for both. They came in the right sequence and at the right time in history for each. Bush did not have the vision or the communicative skills or the kind of public confidence and persona that Reagan had. Could not have done in the early 80s what Reagan did. Reagan's detachment from day-to-day business would have made his management of the actual collapse of communism much more problematic in my view. So you look back and you think, you know, maybe there is a providence that puts these things together. But those two, I would say, were the best. I was at the first of all, I was incredibly junior. President Johnson was the only one of the 8 presidents that I worked for that I never met.
Right.
Because I was just super junior. I will tell you one story about President Johnson's personality, though, from a friend of mine. So CIA was just as divided about the Vietnam War as everybody else. And I had a friend at CIA who was very anti-war. And when the president receives a foreign head of state and there's a state visit, there's a big welcoming ceremony on the south lawn of the White House. And what people don't know is they bus in federal employees to fill the lawn, including CIA. And so my friend said, I'm going to go down there, I'm going to go to that welcoming ceremony, I'm going to get on the rope line, and when the president comes by, I'm going to say, Mr. President, stop the war. So he goes down, he gets on the rope line, and he comes back later, and he says, so I was there. I was right on the front line. I was right on the rope. The president is coming right toward me, and he gets to me, and he sticks out his hand and smiles at me, and I stick out my hand, and I say, good morning, Mr. President. but so those are the two presidents that I think, in terms of sort of vision and day-to-day leadership, made the biggest impact on me.
Who's the most underrated of that group of 8?
Well, I think of the 8, I would say a couple of them. I would start with Gerald Ford. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was an amazing thing to hear Jerry Ford, after he pardoned Nixon, saying, it's time to put this long national nightmare behind us. And Ford pardoned Nixon knowing that it might cost him the election, or in '76. But he thought it was the best thing for the country. And this was a guy who was continually underrated. And you know, it's interesting how public personas get shaped. So Jerry Ford was probably, up to that time, one of the most athletic presidents we've ever had since Theodore Roosevelt. He would go to Vail and he would ski the Black Diamond slopes. And the press would wait at the bottom of the slope for him to fall. And that would be the picture that would run, because he fell down the stairs in Poland of the airplane. And you know, never mind the story when Nixon went to Poland, the plane pulled up on the wrong side of the tarmac, and the entire band had to run under the plane to get to the other side. Or when President Carter went and lusted for the entire Polish nation because of a misinterpretation. But President Ford, once the image got out there that he was clumsy, that it was really hard to shake. But this was a guy who was respected both in terms of international economics and in terms of politics by people who, like Chancellor Schmidt of Germany, President Giscard d'Estaing of France, and others. And I also think 41 has been underestimated. Now, he's fortunate that he's lived long enough to begin to see a reassessment.
Right.
But for a long time, I think that he was underestimated. And you know, if you read Meacham's book, it's clear when he made the budget deal and violated the no new taxes, read my lips pledge, that he knew he was putting re-election at risk, but he did it because he thought it was the best thing for the country. So for me, the ones that make the biggest difference are those who put what they consider the national interest ahead of any re-election concerns.
I understand you're not a historian, but you served Barack Obama. How do you think history will reflect Barack Obama?
I think it's way too early to tell. I think that, you know, I mean, my favorite example is Harry Truman. Harry Truman left office with lower poll numbers than any president in modern American history. He served at a time when the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress. It was incredibly polarizing and partisan, every bit as much so as today, maybe more so. And you know, I was gonna relate the story that I have in both Duty and this story about how my father referred to Harry Truman, which was not in complimentary terms. But come the 1970s and 1980s, 1990s, all of a sudden Harry Truman's a great president. So we lack so much perspective. I mean, it's like this gloom and doom we see today. That's because hardly anybody who's reporting on it was alive in the late 70s. And remember how terrible the late 70s were.
Right. I'll get back to...
Or the late 80s. I mean, the late 60s, for that matter.
Yeah. I'll get back to presidents in a moment, but you were an exemplary public servant for over 50 years. Why are young people not electing to be public servants to the degree that they did in previous generations?
Well, I would have to say I'm not sure, but what you say is absolutely true, and I cite the statistics in the book. There was a Wall Street Journal article about a year ago that said that 28 years ago, or in the late 70s, that 30% of the federal workforce was under the age of 30. And today, as of 2012 or 13, it was 7%. And the thing that I found both at Texas A&M and leading the Boy Scouts is that I think young people are every bit as idealistic today as they've ever been. And particularly when they're in college, and I'm confident it's as true here at UT as it was at A&M, and at William & Mary and most other campuses across the country. There's an amazing involvement of the student body in volunteerism and doing things in the community and so on, much more so than when I was in college. But for some reason, once they graduate, that tends to fade into the background. And I think part of it is that bureaucracies, whether it's local, state, or federal, are seen as so rigid that young people who are entrepreneurial and innovative and want to take responsibility for things look at an environment in which it will be years until they are given the opportunity to do that, and the prospect that they're going to have to serve in a stifling bureaucracy. The truth is, this is, I think, potentially a problem for the military, and I told the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Commandant of the Marine Corps in the last few months I was in office. I would tell the story of when I became secretary. I visited a forward operating base Tillman on the Pakistani border, and here's a young Army captain. He's got 100 U.S. soldiers that he commands. He's training 100 Afghans. He's bulldozing roads. He's building schools. He's negotiating with tribal elders, and he's fighting the Taliban. These were small unit wars, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and both young NCOs and young officers have had the enormous opportunity to innovate, to be entrepreneurial, to be decision makers. And I said, you bring those kids back and you put them in a cubicle doing PowerPoints, you're going to lose them. I think that's part of the perception for a lot of young people graduating from college now, that they're going, if they go into government at whatever level, they're going to end up doing mindless tasks in a very hierarchical organization. So the challenge for those who lead those organizations is, how do you change that environment? And I believe you can do that, and that's part of what the book's about.
You write in the book, despite the many frustrations and very real shortcomings associated with government, I believe Americans here at every level have the most dedicated, capable, and honest public servants anywhere. So is the outsized anger that Americans seem to have toward our government justified, in your view?
Yeah, I think actually Senator Sanders and Donald Trump have tapped into a frustration. Most of the media talks about it being a frustration with elected officials, especially at the federal level. But I think also there is, in some ways, an inchoate frustration with the day-to-day challenges that every American faces in dealing with bureaucracies, whether it's getting a driver's license or dealing with medical insurance or higher education or public education or companies. They face these huge, faceless organizations that are complicated, that are obdurate, that are arrogant, and frankly, often just plain bossy. And I think it's part of that. I mean, whether you're remodeling your home or getting a license for a business or 100 other things, every day there's a frustration. And part of the argument in the book is it doesn't have to be this way. These institutions can be reformed to better serve those that they were created to serve. And I think you can create an environment in which young people are excited. Now, I think, given the quote that you just read, the truth is I think a lot of people who work for these organizations, and I believed it was true at A&M, and I'll bet it's true here at UT as well. There are a lot of people who work in these organizations who are as frustrated as the people on the other side of the counter. And I say that's the great opportunity for the reformer. People want to be proud of the organization they work for. They want to be esteemed for working for that organization. And all of those people are potential allies for the reformer because there are people inside organizations who have great ideas on how to make them better, how to make them operate better, how to make them more effective, how to deal with new challenges and problems. And so the challenge in front of the reformer is how to harness that desire and how to use that internal talent along with a variety of other resources to actually begin to change organizations for the better.
In your career as a public servant, where did you see change affected in the most exemplary way?
Well, not very many places. I mean, I wrote, I am amazed I survived. I wrote my first article on how CIA could improve its analysis of the Soviet Union when I had been at the agency for 2 years. I'm sure my superiors thought that not only was I presumptuous, but I was really stupid. And I think that, I never led an organization that I didn't think could be more agile and better. I loved every organization I led. I loved CIA, I loved Texas A&M, I loved the Department of Defense, and I loved the Boy Scouts. But I also love them enough to know that they can all be better than they are. And so I guess I would say I have always been discontented with organizations because I see how good they are, but I see how much better they could be.
Right. You mentioned you mentioned Trump and Sanders as tapping into an anger that seems to be manifest in this country today. Are there any candidates in either party, this might be a rhetorical question, who you think fit the qualities of great leadership that you enumerate in the book?
I'll answer the question this way. Of the whole panoply of candidates, of both parties, I think there are 2 or 3 that have the qualities and the skills potentially to be a successful president. And no, I'm not going to say who I think.
Well, but you do write in the book.
But 2 or 3.
You write in the book of Hillary Clinton. I worked with Secretary Clinton on foreign policy and national security issues. I found her a good colleague. I found her tough-minded. We worked well together. Can I infer from that you think she has qualities that might make a good leader.
But what I also say is that we never discussed domestic policy. And the truth is, by the spring of 2011, we were beginning to part ways.
Right.
We disagreed on the intervention in Libya, which I opposed. I basically said to the president and others sitting in the Situation Room, can I just finish the 2 wars I'm already in before you all go looking for another one? And so I don't know what would have gone beyond that. And frankly, I had no insight into how she was as a leader of the State Department. So, but in the narrow area that we dealt with each other on policy, I mean, she was a strong advocate of the surge in Afghanistan. We saw eye to eye on Russia and China and Iran. And so we had a very good cooperation and relationship for at least the two of the 2.5 years that I was there.
If you could forget those who...
On the other hand, we never emailed.
Touché. So forget those who have already thrown their hats in the ring. If you could choose someone else outside of the established candidates who might throw his or her hat in the ring, again, based on what you know about leadership, who would you want that to be?
Yeah, I really don't. There really is. I don't have anybody in mind. I think that the most interesting laboratories for innovation in government are happening at the state level with both Republican and Democratic governors. I think states, the thing that I point out in the book is that people who lead mayors and governors are much closer to the people than those who sit in Washington, either in the Congress or in the White House. And if you're a mayor and the trash doesn't get picked up or the snow doesn't get plowed, it doesn't matter what your ideology is, you're toast. And governors have a little bit the same challenge. Most states have balanced budget amendments that require them to balance the budget, which means they have to make tough decisions every 2 years or every year or whatever. And I think that therefore some of the more innovative things going on in government are going on at the state level. I will say there would be virtue for the country, in my view, just personal, if the Congress would emulate Texas in this respect. The legislature meets for 140 days every 2 years.
How do you explain the lack of leadership in Washington?
I think that the one polarization, tough politics have been with us since the beginning of the Republic. I think the one thing the founders never anticipated, particularly with respect to Congress, was that people would, I think they thought you would be a successful person in business or in law or in medicine or farming or whatever. And once successful, as a burden and a sacrifice, go to Washington and serve a while in Congress and then go home. What they never anticipated, in my view, is that you would have people who would spend a lifetime in Congress and people who had never done anything but politics, who had never had any experience outside of Congress. And we have so many people like that in Congress today, or enough of those people, that for them, they can't imagine life outside of Congress. And therefore, and they can't imagine life without the deference and the perks and their psyche of being a member of Congress. And when they leave, they don't go home, they go to K Street. I mean, can you imagine? We had 2 Republican senators in the last election who did not have a residence in the state they purported to represent, Kansas and Indiana. And that would have been inconceivable, in my view, to the Founding Fathers. So, I always have been an opponent of term limits. And because I always felt we had term limits. They were called elections. But the reality is, because of gerrymandering and so on, all but about 50 seats in the House are now safe for either Republicans or Democrats. And so the really important election is the one in February in the primary, and where you appeal to the most hardcore elements of the base. Once you get the nomination, you get the election. And I just worry that we need more people who remember where they came from and are willing to go back there in order to better serve the people. I couldn't wait to get out of Washington.
Mr. Secretary, what would you put on the top of the next president's agenda?
People always are asking me, what's the greatest national security threat to the United States? And my consistent response is, the greatest threat to our national security and our future is found within the 2 square miles that encompass the White House and the Capitol. If we can't figure out how to work together to solve a lot of the really big problems our country has, whether it's the national debt, federal deficits, immigration, education, infrastructure, you name it. If we can't figure out a way to reach across the aisle and in a bipartisan way begin to address some of these problems, there is no single threat as great to our future as that. And I would just draw this analogy. One of the criticisms that I have of both President George W. Bush and Barack Obama compared to President Johnson, and I would say other presidents that I worked for, is that I don't think that they expend nearly the time nor energy to cultivate the Congress and to try and figure out, to cull off enough members of Congress, center left, center right, to build a majority to accomplish some of these objectives. I think that they've both gotten impatient and frustrated and angry with the Congress and basically given up on dealing with the Congress. I remember when I went up for my confirmation hearings in November of 2006, the members of the Senate who were the angriest at President Bush were not the Democrats, but the Republicans.
So let me play out what you just said a moment ago. In order for our country to come together, it necessitates Washington coming together. You're a lawmaker who goes to the district. There is pressure from your party not to reach out to your colleagues. What would a good leader do in that situation in order to effect comity? Not comedy, but comity.
Well, you know, one of the interesting, it's interesting how process begins to affect progress. So I think one of the most negative changes and one of the most deleterious effects of the need for fundraising in congressional races is that the Congress now only meets 3 days a week. And everybody goes home to raise money. And one of the consequences of that is members of each party don't even know the members of their own party, much less those of the other party. When I first went to Washington in the Johnson administration, you had amazing friendships across the aisle. Families would get together, people would play golf together, their families would go on picnics together, and they would argue against each other all day long in committees and on the floor, on the Hill. But at the end of the day, there were friendships. And it's pretty hard to demonize somebody whose kids just were in a little league game with your kids. That's all gone away. These people, most of their families now don't move to Washington. Some of these guys sleep in their offices. So the comity that came from building personal relationships in the old days is pretty much all gone. And that's one of the reasons why these people can be so ugly to each other, because they don't know each other. It's like email. And so, you know, if I were a newly elected president and I were looking at the new leadership of the Congress, I would say, let's do 5-day work weeks. And because everybody, Republicans and Democrats, would be equally disadvantaged in terms of fundraising. But we have to change the atmosphere in Washington, which has become, I mean, it was polarizing and nasty in the Truman administration and in the Adams administration. But if we can't begin to get people talking to each other and figuring out how to solve some of these problems, we're in a heap of trouble.
Earlier this week, you were in Washington when the snow fell.
Yeah, I like to say now the only thing not frozen in Washington are Iranian assets.
I was going to quote you because you mentioned that at A&M yesterday, but which brings us to the deal with Iran. Was it a good deal or a bad deal?
I think that there are aspects of the deal that are quite positive. Getting 97% of enriched uranium out of Iran is good. Having them dismantle 2/3 of their 19 or 18,000 centrifuges is good. Having them forcing them to change the Iraq reactor so it can't produce plutonium is a good thing. On the other hand, as late as last April, the administration was saying we have to have anytime, any place inspections. We gave that up. The administration was saying we have to have a history of their efforts to try and convert their nuclear program into weapons, and we gave that up. I think we wanted a deal more than the Iranians did. That's never a good place from which to negotiate. That said, I think it would be a mistake for a new president to disavow the agreement. Among other things, we will be absolutely alone. We will be isolated, not the Iranians, because we won't be able to get anybody else on board for renewing sanctions, which also means that the assurances of snapback sanctions are really hollow. But the reality is, if we disavow it, we're going to be on our own. What I think should have happened simultaneous with the agreement was a very forceful statement by the president that we were going to be incredibly aggressive in resisting Iranian interference and meddling elsewhere in the region. That we were going to increase our military presence, we were going to increase our military relationships with our friends and allies, increase our intelligence relationships, intensify our diplomatic efforts. We were going to bend every effort to make sure that Iran could not use whatever money it received from the lifted sanctions to create more trouble in the region. The irony is, the Ayatollah gave that speech from the Iranian side. He basically said, the agreement's the agreement, but we are not going to change anything when it comes to going after the great Satan and our aspirations. So I think, and I would just take it a step further, I believe that the hope, and I worry the assumption, that the lifting of the sanctions over time will lead Iran to abandon its ideological, theological, revolutionary principles, its aspirations in the region, its aspirations for a nuclear weapon. I believe that's unrealistic. I don't think that's going to happen. And it may or may not happen, but you have to plan like it won't. And my worry is we are planning like it will.
Is this flawed deal better than no deal at all?
Yeah, I think so. I know that, this whole deal was controversial. And the truth is, as I say, if the president had been as aggressive in saying what we were going to do against Iran as his arguments for doing the deal, I think it would have mitigated the criticism. Look, I started doing strategic nuclear arms control with the Soviet Union in 1970 as a very junior CIA officer. I was an intelligence advisor to our strategic arms delegations. There was never any idea in negotiating those agreements that it was going to have anything at all to do with Soviet activities anywhere else in the world. And it was perfectly clear. The first approach about doing these negotiations actually began under President Johnson in 1968. But when they really got underway in the fall of 1969, there was never any expectation this was going to have anything to do with Soviet aggressiveness anywhere else in the world. So we had a very aggressive containment policy under multiple presidents. At the same time, we were negotiating nuclear arms control. So I don't have a problem with walking and chewing gum at the same time. My problem is that it doesn't seem to me that the administration has embraced that idea.
What is our greatest foreign policy threat right now?
I think that the greatest challenge, first of all, I think that there are more challenges simultaneously than we have faced certainly at any time since the end of World War II. None of them, in my view, are as existential as the conflict that we had with the Soviet Union. But we have to deal with the reality of Iran and Russia and China and North Korea and others. But I would say that my biggest concern is that I believe that the Middle East, from Tunisia to Pakistan, is going to be a center of violence and turmoil for a generation. I think there are 4 conflicts going on simultaneously. The first is Sunni Islam led by Saudi Arabia versus Shia Islam led by Iran. There's authoritarians versus reformers. There's secularists versus Islamists. And maybe most dangerously, there is the question whether artificially created countries with historically adversarial tribal, ethnic, and religious groups, specifically Libya, Syria, and Iraq, can hold together, or whether they will splinter like Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. And I am not an optimist. I believe the borders of the Middle East in 20 to 25 years will be different than they are today. But this country and our friends in Europe and elsewhere face a Middle East that I believe will be in flames for a very long time. And we are all dealing with it a day at a time. And there is no strategy, as there was a containment strategy on how to deal with the Soviet Union, that had bipartisan support that could be sustained from one presidency to the next through 9 presidencies. There is nothing comparable to that in the Middle East, with respect to the Middle East, in American politics, in either party, or in Europe, of how are we going to deal with a region in flames for a very long time.
Well, this is not a monolithic threat in the same manner that the Cold War was. We were facing one nation. Islamic extremism is more fragmented than that. How do we contain ISIS? What do we do to stop the threat from ISIS?
Well, I think fundamentally, first of all, a lot of the strategies or a lot of the moves that are being suggested are, it's like some of these presidential candidates are playing video games. Carpet bombing,
right,
bombing the whatever out of them, making the sand glow, huge numbers of American troops, huge numbers of Sunni Arab troops. These things are not going to happen. The idea that, we're having a debate with the Iraqi government over whether they'll accept a couple of hundred more special operations forces or helicopters. The idea that a Shia-dominated, Iranian-influenced government in Baghdad is going to allow 10,000 American soldiers back in, or combat units of Sunni Arab Gulf states, is a joke.
Right.
It's not going to happen. And so I think that the kinds of things we're doing now to try and strangle these guys, I would intensify those efforts. I think direct support to Sunni tribes, to the Kurds, and to tribes and villages and so on in Syria and elsewhere who are not willing to go try and liberate Mosul, but they may be willing to fight and die to defend their own town against ISIS. We need better intelligence to be able to help those people and to arm them. And I think intensified air attacks with better intelligence, forward air controllers, and so on. So a number of these measures, I think, that we're doing now that can be intensified are important in terms of gradually taking away the caliphate. But I also think, the reality is most Americans are not nervous in terms of their personal security about what's going on in Raqqa. They're concerned about what's going on in San Bernardino. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things that we need to put renewed focus on is in our Muslim communities in the United States and in mosques, getting people more in tune with the reality that the threat of radicalization poses, and having people willing to identify young men who may be being radicalized or imams who are trying to radicalize, and having communities, Muslim communities and Muslim parents come forward and say, y'all need to talk to my son. That's the way you get in front of these things. And so community relations, building stronger relations. I will tell you, the more that anybody tries to isolate these communities or in some way demonize Muslims, the harder it's going to be to make that happen. It is totally the wrong approach to dealing with this challenge. The challenge is, how are we more inclusive? How do we make people feel more that they have a stake in America, that America is going to protect their interests, that we want them here and we value them, but also that means they have a responsibility. If there are members of their community who may be moving toward trying to hurt us, that they identify those people. But that's the approach to take internally, it seems to me.
But is the eradication of the caliphate a necessary step in delegitimizing the Islamic State?
I think that the caliphate has a narrative that is very important for ISIS.
Right.
This notion that they control territory and impose Sharia law and provide benefits and all of that. And I think you have to dismantle the caliphate to eradicate that.
Right. Mr. Secretary, we have 4 students from the LBJ School of Public Affairs who each have questions for you, and they are right out there, and we'll ask the first one to step forward. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Secretary. My name is Andrew Martin. First off, as a fellow Eagle Scout, I'd like to thank you for your leadership of that organization. My question is this. Secretary Carter is currently facing a lot of pushback from his branch chiefs over his spending priorities at the Pentagon. I'd like to ask you what you think those spending priorities should be and how, as a leader, you would handle pushback from those leaders who are his subordinates.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I know what Ash's spending priorities are, but I would tell you that if I were there, the first thing I would be doing would be pointing out the fact that in the last 10 years, out of the last 10 years, there has been an appropriated defense budget at the beginning of the fiscal year twice. That was 9 years ago and 10 years ago. So continuing resolutions and sequestration have built into defense budgeting an uncertainty and an unpredictability that is one of the greatest possible contributors to waste and inefficiency, and it's the fault of the Congress. So my objective, first of all, is getting some predictability in the level of defense spending going forward. And I believe that there is waste in the Defense Department. In a 5-month effort in 2010, we found $180 billion. We cut $180 billion in overhead over a period of a few years. So I think the first thing is predictability. I think the idea of my mantra when I was secretary, and this is probably much more information than you want, but our experience in predicting where we will use military force next since Vietnam is perfect. We have never once gotten it right. From Grenada to Haiti to the Balkans to Somalia to Libya twice, Iraq 3 times, Afghanistan, Libya twice, and so on. So my mantra was we have to be prepared for the potential nation-state conflicts, but we also have to train and equip for the most versatile possible force to deal with the widest possible spectrum of conflict. So my spending priorities would be, how do we build in the greatest possible versatility in the force? The notion, until the invasion of Iraq, or until 2004 maybe, the notion was that if you can fight the big conventional war with the Army, you can fight any lesser conflict. And Iraq proved that that was not true. The Army had rushed as quickly as possible after Vietnam to forget everything it had ever learned about counterinsurgency. And now the Army and the tendency, my worry was the tendency would be after Iraq and Afghanistan to do the same thing. And we can't do that. We have to preserve this flexibility. So my budgetary priorities would be, yes, we have to protect the technology advantages that we must have against a high level of conventional conflict against other nation states, and let's be honest, we're talking about Russia or China, or potentially North Korea, or Iran. But at the same time, we have to understand the probability of those conflicts is relatively low. The probability of the other kinds of conflicts is nearly 100%. And so I think that we need to undertake the modernization efforts that we're undertaking, whether it's the F-35, a new tanker, seaborne drones, new nuclear attack submarines and replacement for the Ohio-class submarine and so on. And I believe we need more ships in the Navy. You know, I don't quote Stalin very often, but Stalin at one point said, at a certain point, quantity takes on a quality all of its own. By 2020, the Chinese will have 350 surface warships and submarines in Asia. We will have 70. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It answers part of it. What about the insubordination from his branch chiefs, though, against his spending priorities?
I never had a problem with that. And part of the reason, well, there were two reasons. The first reason was that I included them in all of my decisions. When I talked about cutting overhead, $180 billion in overhead, I did that after 60 meetings in 5 months, ranging from 1 to 8 hours each. I included the service chiefs in every single decision that I made, and every one of them had every opportunity to make his case for or against certain systems and certain decisions. And I never had a single one of them go to the Hill behind my back. Not once. And so we presented a united front. So in 2009, when I cut 36 major equipment procurement programs that, had they been built to completion, would have cost the taxpayers $330 billion or thereabouts. I never had a single service chief go to the Hill or to the press to try and undercut me. So a part, and it's part of what's in this book, a part of leadership, in my view, is inclusiveness in the decision-making process, so that even if people disagree with the decisions you made, they know that you respected their opinion and they had the opportunity to present their point of view. Insubordination, I'd fire them. I fired the Secretary of the Army 3 months in because I felt that he had not paid enough attention to the treatment of outpatient warriors, wounded warriors at Walter Reed. It wasn't that he didn't know about the problem. It was that once he was informed about the problem, he didn't take it seriously and blamed it in the press on a couple of NCOs not doing their job. I fired him. 10 months later, on the same day, I fired the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force because of lapses in security of nuclear weapons. I relieved the commander in Afghanistan. Much to my astonishment, I should have realized it. Now, you consider all the mistakes the military made in Vietnam and in Iraq and Afghanistan. When I relieved the commander in Afghanistan, it was the first time a field commander had been relieved by a civilian since Harry Truman fired Douglas MacArthur. So I fired a bunch of people, which helped prevent any insubordination.
Next student, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Hello, Mr. Secretary. My name is Karina Jacobs. My question is, how did you use data, research, and analysis in making decisions as a leader? And also, what did you find to be lacking in those sources?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Will you repeat the question,
How did
please?
you use data, research, and analysis in making decisions as a leader? And what did you find to be lacking in those sources?
Okay, so I'll give you a good example of where I used data in making a decision. So the president wanted to change don't ask, don't tell, and get rid of, and change the law. He wanted to do it immediately. And I said, Mr. President, this is a big issue for the military. Give me some time to work it through. We don't know what the military thinks about this subject. Everything we've heard is purely anecdotal. So let me gather some data. And I formed a task force, and the task force came back to me and said, we want to survey 200,000 members of the military. We don't do plebiscites in the military. But this was really, what do you think? What do you think the problems will be? And what's your opinion? We are interested in that. And what are going to be the tough aspects if we change the law? And I said, no, survey 400,000 members of the military and 150,000 military spouses. And what came back as a result of those surveys was that 2/3 of the men and women in the military either thought it would not make any difference at all or that the military would be stronger because of it. And that data helped me persuade the service chiefs that we could move forward with this without harming the readiness of the force. And it helped me persuade some Republican opponents in the Congress that this was going to work out okay. So using the data, I was able, having figured out what people really thought, to move forward with what otherwise would have been an enormously controversial decision. And the truth is, we implemented it, and there essentially have been no problems since the decision was made. So that was one example of where I tried to use research and data to help inform a decision.
We have two more questioners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Secretary Gates, my name is Wyatt Ellertson. Looking back on your life in public service, what do you know now that you wish you would have known at the beginning of your career?
I'd have probably picked another career. You know, I mean that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I think I would have counseled myself to be a little more patient. But you know, I look back and one of the things a lot of young people ask me, well, kind of how do I get from where I'm sitting to where you're sitting? And I talk about the challenge that you have to do all the hard work of preparation, and then you never know. And the one thing that I tell them that you don't generally think of in terms of bureaucracies is that you need to be a risk taker. So I was first asked to go to the National Security Council staff by Henry Kissinger in 1974. I compared going to the NSC at the White House in the spring of 1974 to signing up to be on the crew of the Titanic after it had hit the iceberg. But my bosses at CIA said, if you go down there, don't expect to have a job when you come back. I decided to go anyway. The interesting little factoid is that most of those people were still working there when I became director. But you know, I mean, it's very hard for me to say, you know, what do I know now that I wish I had known then? If I knew then what I know now and where I would end up, it would have scared the hell out of me. Because I like to think that I was self-aware enough to know, I'm not sure you can do that. I think the challenge for young people, and especially for really, really smart type A young people, is that they want to plan everything. They want to have it all laid out in front of them. And I guess therein I find the answer to your question. I thought when I was a young analyst in CIA, I thought my bosses are a bunch of slackers because they don't have a career plan for me. And I want to know kind of where am I going to go from here to there, to there, to there. And I now know that that would have been catastrophic. That I'd have ended up as a GS-15 or the equivalent of a full colonel and never done anything more than that, because it was all so predictable and it was all laid out for me. So what I know now that I didn't know when I was criticizing my bosses was that not knowing what was going to happen next was the best possible thing that could have happened to me in my career.
Thank you.
So you get our last question.
Evening, Secretary Gates. My name is Liam Cosma, and I'm a graduate student here at the LBJ School and an active duty Army officer. And with my question, I wanted to bring it back to where we started the evening, talking about leadership. It feels as if in the military and various units, we cultivate climates where error and failure are not accepted. And however, we all know that failure is often a great way to learn and grow as a professional and as a leader. And I wanted to know if you could talk about a few times where you failed or made mistakes, and how that helped you grow and prepare for your role as Secretary of Defense, and how your organizations that you were in at the time dealt with that failure.
Okay, so I had a good sampling of these, and I write about most of them in the book. So I'll tell you about one. So I had become, I was very young, but I was appointed by then Director of Central Intelligence, Bill Casey, and his deputy, Admiral Bob Inman, to be the head of the analytical side of CIA. And the reason they appointed me, this was the end of 1981, and the reason they appointed me was because they were very dissatisfied with the quality of all analysis coming out of CIA. And I was the director of their executive staff. The truth is, both of them trusted me more than they trusted each other. And so I was the executive director for both of them. And I had written a paper on about a dozen steps that I felt would change the way analysis was done in CIA and dramatically improve it. And they were really impressed, and on the basis of that, appointed me as Deputy Director for Intelligence, the head of analysis in CIA. I went into the auditorium at CIA. I gathered 650 analysts and managers. And I proceeded with an indictment of the analysis that had been done before, no recognition of any positive things. It was a devastating critique. And I informed them of all these changes that were going to happen. And I managed in the space of an hour to antagonize every single person who was going to work for me, several thousand people. Because I had given no credit to the good things that had been done. I had not consulted with a soul about what I was going to do. And so even the people who agreed with my criticisms were angered. And I held that job for over 4 years, and I never got past the negative consequences of that one statement in the auditorium of 1 hour. Now, people came to accept that the things that I was doing were improving analysis. But it was my lesson, it was my first and most significant lesson that I describe in the book about the importance, if you want to bring change to an organization, you need to do it by including people and with transparency. So if I had it all to do over again, I would have met with all the leaders of the different organizations in the analytical side. I would have said, we're not doing as well as we should. What are your suggestions for how we fix it? Well, how about this? Having a dialogue, involving more people, listening to people in the trenches. I may still have made the same 12 recommendations, but I would have brought people along with me. I would have included people in that process. I'll give you one other example about the consequences of demonstrative leadership, temper tantrums. So I called somebody in, they had made in the same job, they'd made a really bad mistake. And I decided, for theatrics purposes that I would put on a little show. So I called this person in and I reamed him out and I slammed my hand on my desk and I said, get the hell out of my office. I don't want to see you. And get out right now. Right now. And the reason I needed them to get out of the office immediately was because I thought I had broken my hand. And I write in the book about hopping around my office, alternately laughing and crying. Laughing because I realized how ridiculous I looked, and crying because my hand hurt so badly. That was the last time I ever did that in my entire career, and that was a long time ago.
Thank you for your questions. Mr. Secretary, one more quick question. Given your passion for leadership, given your ability as a leader, given your vision for change, has it occurred to you to run for president? I mean that quite seriously.
One of my favorite lines from the movies is from the Lethal Weapon movies. And for those of you who've seen them, Danny Glover plays the senior older detective on the verge of retirement, and his young partner is Mel Gibson. And every time Mel Gibson gets them in trouble, Danny Glover says, I'm getting too old for this, S. And that's the way I feel about this. I've served 8 presidents. I think I probably know the demands of the presidency as well as anybody who has not held the job. And it requires somebody younger with a lot more energy and who has a lot of experience, but whose experiences are not limiting. When we were debating the bin Laden raid, and I was opposed to it because I wasn't opposed to killing bin Laden, but I wanted to do it with drones or bombs, not a raid. And I was persuaded to change my mind at the very end. My biggest concern was not whether or not it would succeed, because I knew that Bill McRaven and his team would make it work, and I had total confidence in that. But my worry was whether or not it succeeded, the Pakistanis would close off our lines of communication to Afghanistan, and we would lose the war in Afghanistan because of the Pakistani reaction. And I, in the Situation Room at one point, and I had also been in the Situation Room during Operation Eagle Claw, which was the failed Desert One rescue attempt during the Carter administration. and 2 or 3 other things like this. And I finally turned to the president. I said, Mr. President, I believe that up until now you have believed my experience is an asset to you. But I now believe maybe it's a liability because it's making me too cautious. And that's one of the worries that I would have about that. So I think I'm too old, and frankly, I just think I'd be a terrible politician.
Larry Temple talked about the great tradition that is the Tom Johnson Lectureship. You have enhanced that tradition by being with us tonight. Thank you for that and for your superlative career as a public servant. Thank you so much.